Apologies for the slight delay in our start here. My name is Joseph Krolikowski. I am the QMS Program Manager. I'd like to welcome each of you to the Statutory and Regulatory Requirements, Anticipating Expectations within a Quality Management System, or ISO 9001 Audit. A couple of notes for all of you. We do have all of you on mute, but we absolutely want to address your questions, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not our presentation will be available after we're finished. We do make our presentations available in two ways. First, if you would like to get your hands on the slides, those will be available for download from our website shortly after we're finished. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, you can do so by visiting our website at www.pgr.com. Look for the training link and follow the link for previously recorded webinars. That will take you to our YouTube page where all of our prior recorded webinars are posted. Our presentation for today is going to address the difference between statutory and regulatory requirements. And we're going to dig into why PGR is auditing statutory and regulatory requirements within the context of an ISO 9001 audit. We're also going to highlight where in ISO 9001 itself such requirements are mentioned. I'm going to take you through a couple examples of statutory and regulatory requirements, the most common examples, if you will. We'll have a couple of concluding remarks and then your questions. So to begin with, let's start with what are statutory and regulatory requirements. Now, both of these terms have definitions in the ISO 9000 document. This is, of course, the fundamentals and vocabulary document. Statutory requirement is defined as an obligatory requirement specified by a legislative body. Regulatory is similar. It's an obligatory requirement specified by an authority, mandated by a legislative body. Now, the main difference between them is where the requirements come from. Statutory requirements are from statutes. In other words, these are legal requirements that come from laws passed by government bodies, such as Congress. A regulatory requirement is going to come from a regulation, hence the name, from a authority. So this could be EPA, OSHA, FAA, FDA, etc. Now, regulations are going to generally be rules that are issued, again, by an agency that has been given some form of authority to regulate an industry or to do something, and can be found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. So as an example, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, is statutorily authorized to regulate food and drug safety through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Safety Act. Now, if you want to get down to specific labeling and packaging requirements, you get into Title 21 of the CFR. These are the regulations that are issued by the FDA in order to help them fulfill their statutory authority to regulate. So think of it this way. A statute is the law, and in most cases, it's going to be very general. The regulations are the rules that are developed to interpret the law and ensure that we stay within it, and are usually going to be more specific. For example, a statute might say that an excessive level of a certain pollutant shall not be permitted in or near a major body of water, or something similar. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, will issue regulations that are going to determine what is excessive, what's a major body of water, and also what is to be done to enforce those requirements based on what Congress intended when they passed the statute in the first place. So to bring all of this back to ISO 9001 auditing, why are we looking at these things in the context of an ISO 9001 audit? Well, hopefully you are already aware PJR is held accountable to a number of requirements as an accredited certification body. And none of these requirements are more prevalent than the series of ISO 17021 standards. Now, the 17021-1 standard has a clause that reads as follows. Auditing shall include the client's management system ability and performance regarding the meeting of applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Now, that's very key wording. We're going to be revisiting that a couple of times in the presentation. You'll note that it doesn't say we're auditing the requirements themselves. We're auditing the client's management system ability and performance. Now, in terms of where these requirements pop up in ISO 9001 itself, there's actually 6 clauses where they are mentioned by name. The first of these is 5.1.2a, where it states that top management needs to ensure that statutory and regulatory requirements are determined, understood, and consistently met. This is among the many items that are expected of top management. In 822A1, it states that an organization needs to include statutory and regulatory requirements among the items taken into consideration during the contractual phase with your customer. So in other words, if you are making a product or the customer is asking you to make a product where there are applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, you need to make sure you are taking those things into account in the planning and other phases associated with the build-up to that product. In 8231D, it states that once you've determined those requirements, you need to review those requirements, and you need to do so before you commit to supplying a product or service to a customer. So 822A1 and 8231D essentially are 2 parts of the same coin. They both pertain to the contractual phase. One says you need to be sure that you know what all the requirements are. The other says you need to review those requirements. Now in 833C, it states that you need to include statutory and regulatory requirements among design inputs. If you are responsible for the design of your product, the regulations need to be part of what you factor into the design so that you're not violating laws or regulations. 842C1 says that you need to ensure that any external providers, typically suppliers, are not going to be adversely affecting compliance to statutory and regulatory requirements. So this gets into types of raw materials, finishing services, and so forth. And then lastly, 855A states that you need to make sure that statutory and regulatory requirements are considered in determining the extent of applicable post-delivery activities. So one good example for that might be, let's say that you make a product where the state that you operate in mandates that if you manufacture that product, you need to provide recycling services for that product mandatorily. So that becomes part of what you consider in a post-delivery activity. After you've delivered it, that you may be required by law to recycle it. So why is Perry Johnson, how is Perry Johnson approaching this requirement? So what we've done is we've placed 2 targeted questions in our audit report that pertain to statutory and regulatory requirements. And these questions are intended to kind of prompt investigation and discourse with the auditee. So what are some examples of statutory and regulatory requirements that come up often? Probably the most common here in the United States are the requirements that come from the occupational health and safety field, OSHA. So this is going to get into things like PPE, ergonomics, safety training, and so forth. We have a lot of clients where those requirements apply to their scope of operation. We have a lot of clients that fall under ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. This touches on things like controlled access to the facility, controlled access to records, and so forth. And safety data sheets even, kind of an offshoot from OSHA. The whole idea of handling, use, disposal, etc., of chemical-based products or other items where there might be considerations. This gets into things like product cleaners, product packaging, even things like raw materials might be impacted by safety data sheets. Now, in terms of what applies and how we go about auditing what applies, you have to bear in mind that a lot of what we're doing in the audit that relates to statutory and regulatory requirement, we're already looking at these items. We're already spending time on these items. Customer contracts, customer purchase orders, blueprints and specifications. Often, if there are applicable ITAR or OSHA or EPA or FAA regulations, those things are going to be in the line items of the contract, the call outs on the blueprint. That's where we're going to find these items. Even your own website may have items that are mentioned. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's limits to what we're allowed to look at with this. And we have mentioned emphatically to our auditors that this needs to be limited to a confirmation that our auditee has an effective process for identifying and complying with relevant statutory and regulatory requirements. Again, I put the definition up here a second time. It's the management system ability and performance regarding the meeting of statutory and regulatory requirements. So one good example, if your customer's blueprint has a call out on a particular EPA requirement relating to packaging material, the auditor is going to follow up and see, okay, did you flow that requirement down to the packaging area as one possible example? We're not there to act as an OSHA auditor or an EPA auditor. We are acting to ensure that you are upholding the statutory and regulatory requirements that are applicable, or rather, that you're identifying the statutory and regulatory requirements that are applicable and deploying those requirements. That's the way to kind of understand this process. So here is what we've captured in our audit report. As I said, this two-part question. We're asking our auditors, is there an effective process, yes or no? And then secondly, are there current projects, are there current products that you observed during the audit where it was necessary for you to sample implementation or understanding? And we've asked the auditors to provide us with a summary of what they saw. So this touches on things like I mentioned, like ITAR. This particular example here, they're most likely working in the aerospace industry. So there's DFARS requirements for domestic sourcing on raw materials and so forth. So again, this is an example, but as you can see, this is a fairly straightforward, simple assessment that's done. Now, obviously, it's possible that an auditor may find a disconnect between an implemented process and an applicable statutory and regulatory requirement. But whether or not a nonconformance is going to be issued is going to require a bit of considered discretion. Does this issue impact customer satisfaction or the attainment of an objective? Does it impede the organization's ability to manufacture its product or render its service? Does it violate a customer requirement? And if a nonconformance is warranted, the auditor has to ensure that the requirement cited includes an appropriate clause from ISO 9001:2015. After all, that is still the primary criteria that we are applying in these audits. In conclusion, we want to ensure that we are providing our valued clients with a great audit and we're meeting all applicable requirements. We do hope that the points of our presentation today are going to help you better understand what our expectations are in terms of statutory and regulatory requirements in the context of an ISO 9001 audit. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have a presentation on the interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. We do this presentation about twice a year. It's a great dive into how to develop your understanding of processes and show their interface. We also have a presentation shown about twice a year on non-applicable clauses and exemptions and understanding what can and cannot be excused in an audit assessment. And we've actually got webinars on a whole lot of other topics, Stage 1 auditing, ISO 9001 itself, and several other standards. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best option for doing that is to visit our website at www.pgr.com. If you go to the bottom of the page, enter your email address and click subscribe, you will be opted in for news updates automatically, including upcoming webinars, changes to standards, and other points of information. I do thank you for your time. At this time, I will address any questions that anybody has. Okay, it would appear there are no questions today, so I will wish all of you a great holiday season. Thank you for your attendance.